Hello, welcome to your week 5 overview. This is week 5 of 5. This is it, the last stretch, the home stretch. So you'll have your module to do this week like usual, and you will also have your final to complete. So this overview video will talk specifically about chapter 5 and what to do for the week 5 module, as well as what to do to ensure that you've wrapped up everything and end the semester on a high note, on a successful note. So as usual, this module, the week 5 module, will have 5 tasks. You'll have this video to watch. You'll have your task 2 with everything to read, watch, and listen to. And then you'll have your 3 assignments, the social media discussion post, the quick facts check-in, and your short answer response. Remember that for task 3, that discussion post, there are 5 scheduled for us this summer, but only 4 count in the gradebook. I scheduled 1 more than was necessary so that students could choose to skip one at some point during our short time together. And if you haven't skipped one yet, but you've completed the other 4, you've earned all the points in that grade category. So you don't have to do the week 5 social media discussion post unless you want to, right? But there's no, sort of extra points associated with that. Remember for the quick facts check-in, to read the questions closely, to go back and read your notes, make sure that you are engaging with my announcements and emails. As the course progresses, our quick facts check-ins and our short answer responses are getting, more thoughtful and requiring more effort on your part. So not only will you have these 5 tasks to complete, but you'll also have your final. So for this week, everything is due by Friday, June 7th, the week 5 module, any makeup work that you want to complete from previous weeks, and your final are all due Friday by midnight. If you have any questions, confusions, worries, please reach out now, reach out sooner rather than later so that I can help you make a plan of action, so I can kind of talk out with you what you need to do to make sure that you end this semester on a successful note. So Praxis, feminist praxis is the topic, our threshold concept for this chapter. Feminist praxis is a way of articulating the fact that theory and scholarship can't just stand on its own, that it has to be connected to social action, social change, right? It's also a way of articulating that social actions, right, work best when they're grounded in knowledge, in theory, in understanding of the social world. Otherwise, those actions may not be as successful, right? And how do we make sure that that's happening is through reflection. And so there's a sort of Venn diagram here illustrating the ways, or at least, a representation of the way to think about feminist praxis as this interrelationship between theory, action, and reflection. A key focus of feminist activism, per our authors on page 235, a key focus of feminist activism has been the idea that women have the right to control their own bodies. And I would also add transgender people and gender non-binary people, right? And so if we're studying, sexism, gender-based violence, transphobia, transmisogyny, homophobia, patriarchal control, we're not just going to study it and be like, well, that's it. We're going to study it because we want to create change, because we want actions, right? We're studying previous actions to see what was successful or not. We are engaging in work that is transformational. And that makes women, gender, and sexuality studies as a field of study fairly unique, similar to our peer department on campus, comparative race and ethnic studies, CRESS, right? Ethnic studies, WGST, these are social justice-born academic disciplines. Feminist praxis is committed to identifying and challenging sexism, patriarchal control, and gender-based violence, right? We do this through understanding specifically how thought and action inform one another. Another way to think about this is that praxis means that you're aware of how power flows to create our intersectional society. So again, this is all building on what you've been reading all semester. Activism and praxis may seem like they're the same term, but they're actually not synonymous, because you can be an activist and engage in actions without understanding the background into why you are advocating what you're advocating for, right? For example, there are young people today who are advocating for, we just ended Pride Month, LGBTQ plus Pride Month, and they're advocating for, no kink at Pride. They are advocating for cops to be included at Pride, which is a misreading and misunderstanding of how Pride emerged, right? In the United States, LGBTQ plus Pride started as a result of uh, LGBTQ plus people, largely transgender women of color, standing up against police violence, right? Police were raiding bars where LGBTQ people were regularly hanging out. Back then, it was, quote, illegal to well, it was illegal to, quote, dress as the other gender, right? And this is way back in the 50s and 60s. And so one day when the cops came to arrest everybody at this bar where trans women and drag queens and butch lesbians and gay men were all hanging out, and they were going to round everybody up and take them downtown, they decided to fight back, and they did. So Pride is actually a celebration of a riot against police brutality, because the way that police treated people when they were doing these arrests were pretty horrific, right? Physical violence, sexual violence, obviously emotional violence, right? Not seeing people as human is very dehumanizing. So if you're not aware of that knowledge, right, then your activism is lacking. And so if you're arguing for things like including cops at Pride, you're misunderstanding what Pride is supposed to represent, and also misunderstanding how we're trying to create social, systemic, structural change, right? Thinking about activism and praxis as the same means that you're missing the point of trying to understand, study, learn how and why power flows between individuals and structures and institutions, right? Praxis is, according to our authors, the intersection of theory and praxis. The intersection of theory and practice is praxis. It involves a visible and deliberate set of actions informed by theory, by research, and by evidence. Similarly with Pride, you'll hear things like no kink at Pride sometimes from younger generations, kink meaning, people wearing leather and spikes, people who are engaged in BDSM, bondage, discipline, sadomasochism, because that has long been a part of Pride celebrations, because Pride is about embracing all the queerness, all the things that go against the heteronormative, that's a big word, but if you continue on with WGST, you'll learn more about it. Going against and challenging heteronormative assumptions about sex, sexuality, and sexual expression. This is why you learn about intersectionality before you learn about praxis in this book and in this class, right? All WGSS practitioners, whether we're scholars, students, learners, activists, right? We are engaging in praxis because we want to stop violence and hatred. Praxis is not reactionary because it is grounded in thought and theory. It's grounded, it's community-centered, it's visionary, right? And so in learning about intersectionality first, you're first learning, as our authors say on page 158, in order to understand how individual social locations are shaped, it's important to see how systems of privilege and oppression intersect, right? From our previous chapter. Here's another illustration. Again, Kimberly Crenshaw, if you remember, is the Black legal feminist scholar who coined the term intersectionality, right? As this lens through which you can see where power and people collide, right? Where things lock and intersect. It's an acknowledgement that everyone has their own unique experiences of discrimination and privilege. And that's what a lot of you wrote about last week, is carrying with you perhaps many privileges, but also oppressions, right? The ways in which those intersect to shape your lived experience, right? Saying that we all carry privileges and oppressions doesn't mean that, how do I say it? Everybody works really hard, right? Everybody is working really hard, and yet there's social structures in place, as you can see over here with the wheel of power and privilege, social structures in place that make it easier for some people to succeed. And by succeed, I mean, be able to afford rent or a mortgage, be able to afford food on the table, be able to walk around in public without being shamed, harassed, spit on, or violently hurt, right? So I encourage you to pause here, and you can play with or look at the wheel of power and privilege, understanding intersectionality in this way, because that is the way that you can start to understand how and why praxis becomes so important. Another way to think about this is that intersectional feminist theory, if you remember from last week, refers to both the intersection of our personal identities, but those only have meaning because of the intersection of the processes of privileges and oppressions in our social institutions, structures, and norms, right? And this is why WGST and CRES are very committed to transformational, decolonial, social justice oriented classrooms, scholarship, and engagement, right? One way that you can also think about this, I know my head's cutting this off a little bit here, so I'll tell you about it. And you may have seen this illustration in other classes. Usually we talk about equality, and as you can see here, the equality means everybody gets the same box, but that doesn't mean that everybody can see over the fence in order to view the baseball game. So equality, everybody has equal access. Here, everybody has equal access to the same box, but some people, right, the short person there on the end, perhaps the child, needs more height in order to be able to see the game. So then we hear about this word equity, right? And oftentimes when you hear about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, this is what they mean. Equity means making sure everybody has the sort of access to being able to see over the fence to see the game, right, in this illustration, right? It's understanding that just providing, say, equal access, everybody can go to the same public school, for example, that may not overcome other structural issues like this fence. A broader way to think about this, and this is how WGST, CRES, right, other social justice board academics, academic areas of study, look at this in terms of not just equality and equity, but liberation, right? Justice. If we look at the reality of things, as you see over here on the side, there's someone who doesn't even need all the boxes, who has all the boxes, who can see the game very clearly. Someone who's barely just able to see over the fence, and then the other person actually, in a hole, so even less likely to be able to see over the fence, right? Liberation would mean getting rid of that structure, right? The structural inequality here is that fence. And so this is obviously a metaphor for understanding and illustrating the ways that structural inequalities from institutions, from education to healthcare to our government, right, often stand in the way of liberation. And so WGST, all the scholars, all the examples that you've been reading about in your book all semester, we are concerned with this idea of liberation. Which means we have to know our own histories. We have to know how our societies work around us. We have to know our community's needs, right? And this is why, and you've read an excerpt from this book, and you've also read about the book in a couple different chapters in our assigned book. The book, Transforming Scholarship, Why Women's and Gender Studies Students Are Changing Themselves and the World. Those authors note that one of the main goals of feminist research projects is to support social justice and social transformation. These projects seek to study and redress the many inequalities, inequities, and social justices that continue to undermine and even destroy the lives of women and their families. Right? I also included this quote, side note, as an example of how to quote a quote. So in case anybody wants to do that for your final or for your last short answer, here's a way to quote how our authors actually cited Berger and Radeloff in their book. So check that out on their page 211 so you can kind of see what I did there. I also encourage you to, if you have the time and are interested in perhaps exploring WGST as a major or a minor, check out our website. You can Google us. We have an annual magazine. I think the most recent one that's up is this one from 2000, from last academic year, not the most recent one that's just passed. But you'll get an idea of all the work that students and faculty are doing. Because there are key elements of WGSS classrooms that are foundational to feminist praxis. So again, these are elements that make us unique from other disciplines, right? From sociology, from business. For us, if we are going to think about feminist praxis as a threshold concept, that means that students are learning these particular things in the classroom. You are engaging your critical thinking skills, right? You are learning how to not just think critically, but how to take in that information, digest it, and understand it through a lens of, let's say, justice, liberation, equity, right? You are learning about empowerment and leadership and how it's not just people perhaps with the most money or who are the most highly placed in politics who create social change, but oftentimes people on the ground in your communities who are engaging in those leadership efforts, and you can too, right? Youth are often at the forefront of many social justice efforts in the United States, right? The immigrants' rights movement, the undocuqueer movement that I introduced a little bit about last week, the immigrants' rights movement in the United States was largely fueled by high school and college students in the probably in like 2010, a little bit before, a little after, right? And so it was students, right, who did that organizing, and I was there and got to see it. And now there's been books written about it by other scholars, like WGST scholar Anita Revilla, who wrote a book or a chapter for a book called Marching Students, right? It's students who often create this change. It's students who make us pay attention, right? You're also learning how to connect knowledge and experiences, right? Again, this idea, if we're talking about praxis, thought alone isn't very useful. Action alone isn't very useful, but that interconnection of thought and action becomes really useful because then you're applying knowledge for social transformation. You are engaging in that work. Again, I'm sorry, my head is kind of blocking out a little bit here. But I put the page numbers of each of these key points that are part of what our authors are providing you and understanding how feminist praxis really shapes the field of WGSS. Another way to think about this is looking at all the examples, right, from our book, from your social media posts all semester, from some of our other readings. What does feminist praxis look like? Oftentimes we think about either feminist action or we think about membership and participation in formal and organized organizations, right? So we think feminist action, like the women's marches every January. The Women's March is now a national nonprofit and holds a national march in a particular city each year, and other cities have solidarity marches at the same time, right? Hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people have now participated in women's marches in the United States, right? It's feminist action. The women's marches started as a protest of then President Trump being elected president because of his horrifying treatment, right, of women, right? He and now we know, right, he's been found guilty, right, of sexual misconduct, right? We have him on tape saying these things. Doesn't matter. People still support him, right? And so then we have to engage in feminist action as to explain why that's not, why that's problematic and why that is itself a form of violence. Membership and participation in formal, organizations, right? Like the National Organization for Women, like Advocates for Youth that some of you have looked at this semester, like Trans Equality here in Texas, like Planned Parenthood, like the T Fund, the Texas Equal Access Fund here in Texas, right? Being part of an organization. And that tends to be what we think about when we think about praxis and action. But activism and praxis can actually be many, many different things. You can think about, as they do that example of activism with limited capital, right? So how are you getting the word out about a particular issue or concern, right? That deep canvassing, working with local politicians, working with local community members to deeply engage with your community. This idea of praxis as text, right? The books that we are reading, the magazines that we're engaging in. I would say this also includes, and your authors say this also includes social media. Social media has become an amazing platform for sharing activist ideas, for sharing thoughts around gender justice, right? And a truly gender inclusive society. But that also means looking then at the interactions between digital activism and in real life, that IRL activism, right? Especially as we try to avoid slacktivism, right? This idea of slacktivism meaning, yeah, it's easy to retweet something. Yeah, it's easy to sign a online petition. Is that really creating change? Not necessarily, but it is getting that particular individual engaged. And that is often a first step, right? But if it's your end all be all step, right, then it's not as engaged as some of these other forms of praxis, right? And also everyday activism. That's the other word that's cut off there. Everyday activism. interrupting your friends or family, or calling in your family, or calling out your friends or family when they make something, make a really sexist or racist joke, right? When they say something that's particularly offensive, when they, um, you know, um, you know, even calling out a professor, right? When something like that is happening in your classrooms, right? That everyday activism of engaging with yourself and others 100% counts as this idea of feminist praxis. There's a feminist saying, expect resistance, right? Like my existence, right, is here. If you don't respect my existence, expect resistance. So just existing is a form, I would say, of social justice, at least of liberation, right? When we exist in a world that doesn't, for example, want women to have control over their bodies, when we exist in a world that, for example, doesn't even want to see trans or gender nonconforming people being allowed in, outside of their homes, right? That simple act of existing is a powerful statement. So I want to talk about a couple other things just to give you some examples of stuff, and then we'll wrap up this video. So one of the things that our authors talk about is allyship, and you can check that on page 226. And so what does allyship mean, right? You are an ally when you are engaging in assistance, support for a liberatory project that is related to an identity other than your own. Right. So, for example, I am somebody who engages with anti-racism efforts a lot, right? Black Lives Matter, the undocu queer justice movement, immigrant rights movement, right? I myself am not Black, I'm not immigrant, right? But I'm an ally to those particular issues and to those groups of people, because those are often also my friends, right? And people I know and people in my community. And so I'm in being a white person and checking that white privilege to engage in anti-racism work. Right? So, for example, if you want to be an accomplice to drag queens in the LGBTQSQQIA+++ community, there's so many of us under that rainbow acronym. It could mean things like going to drag shows, voting in politicians who are not transphobic or homophobic, calling out or calling in friends or family when they do things that are particularly transphobic or homophobic. You can also check out the class that we teach at TCU called The Queer Art of Drag that gets taught each spring and culminates in the TCU Drag Ball. You could also just attend the drag performance, right? Students in the class are taught to create their own drag persona, and then create their own videos and also live performances. You learn from drag queens in the Fort Worth and Dallas area. You learn the history of how drag queens are really instrumental in LGBTQ plus justice and rights and efforts here in the DFW area. Right? It's a really powerful course. Students I know who have taken it have absolutely loved it. And it's also an issue that is very central to women, gender, and sexuality studies. Women, gender, and sexuality studies is concerned about major overarching issues like reproductive justice, and gender justice includes trans justice and LGBTQ plus justice. And I share this with you because there's a lot of backlash. So, for example, a bunch of us got this email earlier in June that had the subject, The Queer Art of Drag, that says TCU has lost touch with what the C stands for. Totally disgusting and immoral. I can only hope that all the funding for the school goes away and that attendance fades to zero. It was in the news, Fox News, a couple other more conservative Christian newspapers kind of picked up on it. And so it really caught on last month. And let's be clear that this happened during Pride Month. And I don't think that it was a mistake that they started to attack our class during Pride Month, right? So there's been a lot of backlash against this. And so I wanted to show a couple headlines and then also start to show some of individuals' tweets, right? So this person says, TCU does so much to make the DFW area proud. What an unfortunate and unnecessary blemish. Here's a bunch of tweets. I just did a screenshot of people who were reacting to the commenting on the post from Fox News. Ranging from emphasizing Christian to calling it sick. Nope, don't believe you. God will not look fondly on these people when they die. They need to remove Christian from their name a long time ago. That's a big no. This is why allyship becomes really, really important, right? We need praxis in order to create social change. And part of that praxis means that even if it's an issue that isn't directly impacting you, it is directly impacting the people around you. Do you care about the people around you? And that is sort of at the heart of feminist allyship and being an ally. Sometimes you'll also hear this phrase accomplice, because ally has been a little bit co-opted, as social justice terminology often is. This is why courses like ours become politicized, but in many ways are actually super, super, super important in order to understanding how the social world works and these roadblocks, hatred, structural, hurdles that we're going to run up against in trying to create social change. Ironically, as some of you know, because I've commented on it, I encourage some of you to, or all of you, whoever would like to check out the Divinity School on campus here at TCU, because the Divinity School, which again, it's a divinity school, so you would think that they would be the uber Christian of TCU. The Divinity School is incredibly accepting of LGBTQ plus people. They just had an event last spring bringing in a Tibetan monk called This Monk Wears High Heels, right? And it was someone who is more of a gender nonconforming monk who then also wears high heels, right? And so this assumption that the Bright Divinity School is going to be this bastion of conservatism, that's not what it is. Christianity doesn't have to be that, right? Here's another example of allyship to give you one that's a little bit more fun. So this was a few years ago now, but Lizzo, probably all love Lizzo, I love Lizzo, sent one of her dresses to an author who had won an award in the Out 100 for her book. And her book here is on the side, Gumbo Yaya. And so Ariel Marie reached out, did a thing on, I think it was Twitter, that said, Lizzo, help me. I'm a, big woman and I don't have anything to wear to this gala. I would love to borrow your dress, right? And Lizzo actually saw the video and literally actually sent it to her. And so it's this moment of allyship as joy, right? It was very joyful. And so I encourage you to, again, also check out what it is that WGST is doing. This comes from our WGST annual magazine that I showed you earlier in this video. Again, just some examples of what it is that we do and why. And I also wanted to provide an example of how, from last week, we talked about how there's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not lead single issue lives. And that even in a news report dragging TCU for offering the queer art of drag, that not only were they connecting that, as we do in the class, about how the gender binary is part of colonialism, which is very much part of white supremacy, right? It also then got connected to pro-choice and reproductive justice efforts, right? And so, again, this article that's supposed to just be kind of focusing on the queer art of drag course also then said it's a disgrace for a large Christian university to offer credits for internship at Planned Parenthood, right? Which is really the largest abortion connector in the nation. And so, yes, TCU has offered a course on the queer art of drag. Yes, TCU has offered internship credit hours for places like Planned Parenthood of Greater Texas, right? And so you start to see how and why it's really important to understand that even people's, hatred is often intersectional itself. If you're curious and you want to learn more in this coming, semester or this coming academic year, please check us out. The WGST minor is just 18 credits, or 15, yes, 18 credits. We also do an emphasis that is only 15 credits, right? We have two different majors, the BA and the BS. A lot of students double major with us because WGST is such an amazing complement, really, for any field of study. Business, social work, economics, education, right? The BA major is 30 credits, which is 10 classes. The BA, right, all BAs at TCU have that foreign language requirement, and it focuses more on theory. Our BS is 33 credits. It's 11 classes, one extra class, and that focuses more on how to actually engage in social justice, how to actually engage in that transformation. So you can take an internship where you might, for example, intern with Planned Parenthood of Greater Texas, or with the Texas Equal Access Fund, or with the AFIA Center, or with LGBTQ Saves, which is a local LGBTQ plus youth organization, right? The BS major is also requires a statistics class, just so you know. I also encourage you to follow us on Instagram. We usually have some really awesome students who help curate our Instagram and our Twitter. So that's it. Thank you for watching this video. Thank you for an amazing summer session. It's been a really powerful few weeks together. I'm really impressed with the level of work that students have been able to produce in this short of a time. And I just appreciate your commitment to your own educational journey. Remember, there's 5 tasks this week plus your final. So, you watch this video, check, and then continue on down the list of tasks for the week 5 module plus the final essay. I am hosting a final last optional study hall Zoom on Thursday at 11:30 to 12:15. You can drop in at any time there. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop in at the optional study hall. Feel free to email me. Feel free to text me. I am here to help. Thank you again for a really powerful, awesome summer, and I hope things wrap up very well for you. Thank you so much.